It's a privilege to welcome Ben Katchor, author of the Dairy Restaurant. Ben is a critically acclaimed cartoonist, illustrator, and author. The creator of Julius Knipple, the comic strip Julius Knipple, real estate photographer, winner of MacArthur and Guggenheim fellowships. And it's a real privilege, as I noted, for me. I'm Morris Vogel, the president of the museum, to welcome Ben this evening. It would be terrific if we could be doing this program on the Lower East Side. We wish that we were welcoming you there this evening. Perhaps later, Ben, after this talk, after things return to some sort of normal, you'll let me host you at the museum. I'm going to turn the screen over to Ben in one second. He's going to start with a presentation. I'll then ask him, we'll have a conversation, and then we'll open it up for questions. And we invite all of you watching on YouTube to submit questions through chat. I can also tell you at the outset that The Dairy Restaurant, the book that we'll be talking about this evening, will be available at your local bookseller, and is available and through McNally Jackson, with a local bookseller in New York, through which the Tenement Museum works. So Ben, let me turn the screen over to you.
Okay, thank you, Morris. I can do this. Okay, do you see that?
I do.
Great. So this is by way of a brief introduction for people who don't know what any kind of dairy, what that term even means, a dairy restaurant. Some of you may be familiar with the B&H Dairy Luncheonette on 2nd Avenue, or remember Ratner's down on Delancey Street. These are, well, one is still in business. Ratner's closed several years ago. These are the last well-known examples of a kind of restaurant that reached its height of popularity in the mid 20th century. And these restaurants catered to the more than 2 million Eastern European Jews who immigrated to America in that period. The dairy restaurant offered an amalgam of regional cuisines that developed in Poland, Russia, Romania, and in the Austro-Hungarian Empire over hundreds of years. And these dishes were adapted to comply with Jewish dietary law. And one aspect of that law forbid the mixing of milk and meat, and resulted in a cuisine of dishes based on dairy, cheeses, sour cream, and then vegetables, grains, and fish. And these are dishes like blintzes, cold beet borscht with sour cream, knishes, and gefilte fish. For people who no longer follow these dietary laws, the smell and taste of the cuisine had an appeal of its own. In the process of uncovering the history of these restaurants through archival research and interviews, I came to understand their place in a larger history of institutions designed to feed travelers that goes back to antiquity. The dairy restaurant could only come into existence when those ancient dietary laws encountered the invention of the restaurant, that unique institution of the mid-18th century France. Instead of offering a single dish of the day, the restaurant endeavored to feed people according to their individual biological needs and tastes. Diners could choose what they felt like eating from a large menu of carefully prepared dishes or restaurants. Beyond matters of culinary taste, choosing a restaurant or cafe in early 20th century New York became a social and political act. Restaurants and cafes on the Lower East Side catered to socialists, anarchists, Orthodox Jews, and specific national cuisines. That's Joseph Moskowitz in a Romanian wine cellar. He's a cymbalon player. And these restaurants appeal to the American public wanting to experience exotic subcultures. Food choice could be a move toward assimilation or a wholesale rejection of the majority culture. For some, meat eating was associated with the appetitive and aggressive behavior of the upper classes. Dairy restaurants also catered to a brand of vegetarianism associated with Leo Tolstoy and his Christian anarchist beliefs. My history explores the pastoral impulse, that desire in the face of spreading industrialization and urban life to return to an unspoiled natural environment with its attendant foods and curative atmosphere, from the Garden of Eden and Arcadia to the public pleasure gardens of 18th century England, to the growth of health resorts throughout Europe. That's the writer Shalom Aleichem in Marienbad. And people went to take a milk cure and water cure too. The same hunger for unspoiled lands incidentally led to the European conquest of much of the world. The small, desperate restaurateurs who ran those hundreds of now forgotten dairy restaurants chronicled in my book were engaged in the hopeless task of offering the working and middle classes an opportunity to partake of the pastoral impulse within the four walls of a store and the commercial restraints of a brutal market economy. For a contemporary vegan or anyone aware of the ruinous effects of industrialized animal-based food production, the history of the dairy restaurant may seem to involve quaint and meaningless distinctions. The purpose for compiling this history is to remind us that the city was once composed of countless small businesses offering a wide range of idiosyncratically designed environments in which to eat while imbibing the political ideologies of your fellow diner, and that the serious business of feeding people was not driven solely by the desire to maximize profit. My book tries to unravel the history of that restaurant culture. So that's the end of my little presentation. Stop the sharing. Do you see me again?
I do,
Great.
and
So,
thank you. Thank you for both presenting the images and for that reading.
You're welcome.
So if I haven't made it clear before this, I find the book delightful, learned, and extraordinarily witty. It's a piece of history. It's a piece of historical writing that's actually fun to read. It's a real pleasure the way that you've brought these various elements together, and you've already had experiences with the audiences, the readers of the book. I presume that when you get questions, you're going to have a lot of people are going to ask you in ways to reflect on experiences of that they remember from grandparents, from Bubby, from Zadie. And what I found, one of the points that you make in the book is that when you shifted your exploration from literally from the Garden of Eden through Europe, the old world, as you shifted your exploration to from that background to New York and to the Jewish dairy restaurant, you noted, I think provocatively, and I wrote this down, the idea that culinary traditions form a visceral link between us and our ancestors is just bad theater. The notion that somehow we can get back into a past by through these touchstones. Did you mean that to be provocative?
Yeah,
Is that a?
I'm trying to find what the context of that remark was. You know what page it was on?
Yeah, 225. Yeah, I don't want to turn this into a seminar. It's
No, I'm curious because somebody asked me about that. 225.
and I think you're absolutely right, by the way.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, I think,
it's the second full paragraph.
yeah, well, that's just the danger of history, thinking it's just a matter of populating, an antique store, and then you've got this this world. And I think it's more like another universe, the past, and people's. Somebody brought up the idea of. I go into this whole idea about itinerant milk sellers, people who came around with cows or goats to sell people fresh milk. And somebody said, well, didn't it smell terrible and next to a cow that, was it's the droppings of the cow? And I tried to explain, I think these were givens. The smell of manure in a world of horses and carriages was everywhere. And people had were tuned to different tolerances for smells and everything. So maybe that's what I was talking about, the difficulty of trying to recreate the past.
Yeah, when people visit the Tenement Museum, we have literally recreated the homes of perhaps a dozen of the families who lived in this now National Historic Landmark tenement building, the building that dates from 1863 on Orchard Street. And some of them expect a romanticized past with certain touchstones. They expect to see grandparents living in spaces like that. And our educators try to make the story as complicated as they can. There are smells, there is discomfort. There are 12 people in a little home of maybe 350 square feet. There is high mortality. These aren't good lives. These are lives that people survived. And yet we are the winners. And we look back from our world and we think of, geez, we look at the wonders of their lives without understanding how difficult and complicated they were. And I think you make clear with how different the world is out of which these experiences come. And do a brilliant job.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy for somebody to open up a dairy restaurant again. It might be an upscale kind of place that has this menu, but what's missing is the whole social and cultural world that these things existed in. And that's sort of, looking back at this project, that's really what attracted me to these places, that these were the last remnants of a working or lower middle class Jewish world. I mean, something you can still find bits of in Hasidic neighborhoods, or you can find it in Chinatown, you know, where there is still a working class restaurant culture. But, you know, that remnant of Eastern European culture in New York is what I think appealed to me about these places. And yeah, that's hard to replicate a moment in history.
You also, in another place in the book, that there's a slim surviving evidence for working class Jewish restaurant culture. You talk about the efforts that you talk about the bits and pieces of evidence, literally matchbook covers, small pieces of newspaper articles, through which you have managed to reconstruct that story, and you invite readers to participate in this reconstruction if they have memories of places that for which you have found very little.
Yeah, maybe before the 1950s or 60s, there wasn't a lot of writing about you know, these kind of details of the working class. Most journalism covered the kind of a more elite part of the society. So, you know, a small restaurant, there's a lot about Delmonico's. That was a very famous, one of the fanciest restaurants in New York. There's tons about that. It's very well documented, but very little about these Jewish dairy restaurants. Almost nothing. I mean, scant hints. And I had to piece together almost, and that's why part of the book is talking about everything you can know about restaurant culture in the early 20th century. And then almost by omission, you can say, well, there was this other kind of restaurant. So it was part of the project.
And you bring a creative sensibility to it. You can, more than perhaps a historian who has made a career out of just the document, very linear, going through the documentary record in a linear way. It's your imagination that creates the image around the object or the piece of the fragment that's left, and then turns that into the core of the story.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want it to become historical fiction. I tried to resist that, but I think I go a bit more into speculation than a real historian would do, because I just had to try to imagine things. But, and then I tried to filter the images through drawing, my handwriting, and, you know, rather than use the scant photographic evidence of most of this stuff. So a lot of it is reconstructions of things.
And the drawings let you do that in an absolutely brilliant way. The words are very good. I don't mean that to suggest that they're not, but the drawings really pull it together. And
yeah, it definitely needs this kind of spatial reality of, but that's something hard to do with text alone. So yeah, I used a lot of, it's just filled with drawings.
So let me push you a little bit beyond what you did in focusing on the dairy restaurant. You see it as really an expression of a Jewish working class culture. And what I wonder is if you would talk about how your you're reconstructing this, what kind of insights it gave you into that Jewish working class culture.
Well, that every Jew is different, and the idea that there's this kind of monolithic Jewish culture or community is just not what I discovered. There were restaurants, for every political sect and every geographic, these Landsman organizations had their own little restaurants where they'd have the cuisine of that town. And yeah, that's one part of it. Nowadays, I think there's sort of a kind of impulse to kind of unify, the Jewish communal world, but I didn't see that. I think that's one thing I discovered. And then, the details of running a restaurant on it. Well, you're a hands-on restaurateur. You're not hiring people to run the place, but you're there every morning, putting on all the soups and preparing. It's an insane amount of work. And most of these people absolutely didn't want their children to go into business because it was such a hard business. And they aspired for them to, go to school and be professionals. And that's another, issue that comes up, I think, in this research. That seems like, the inevitable direction of working class immigrant cultures. Not just Jewish, to sort of somehow try to better themselves, but by bettering themselves, move away from this kind of hands-on, the trade of cooking and running a restaurant, maybe hiring somebody to do that and just managing the place. So I think it's hard to celebrate the aesthetics of a working class culture because it is a thing of a period, and to bring it back is a complicated issue because people, there's this idea that there's always somebody else you can hire to do this kind of dirty work for you. And that's kind of where we are, where a lot of people have, moving into the leisure class, want to do as immaterial a kind of work as possible, finance, things like that. So
there's an irony in that some of the children of some of these restaurateurs became professionals, became better off, and now their children, in some cases, have this ideal of opening a restaurant. So it just as the folks who earn their livings in sweatshops making garments, so that their children could go, I don't know, to dental school or law school, now find their grandchildren moving back to the Lower East Side and opening a dress shop or a small restaurant.
Yeah, I think people felt something was lost when, especially the idea of a small hands-on business. I think the direction of the culture, toward multinational chains and things like that, it's really glaring. All you have to do is look at a photograph of any street on the Lower East Side, and you see this richness of, visual invention. Every store looks a little different, and there's this density of, I don't know, all I could call it is invention. It's one of the things that poverty forces you to do, is it be incredibly inventive and come up with ways of doing things. And the minute you have a lot of money behind you, you become a Starbucks. and the most boring kind of cafe solution to what a cafe should be. So anyway.
The notion of invention is, I think, a powerful one. People made something of nothing. They took goods that were out of season or seconds or goods that were out of fashion and developed the idea of the discount or the basement store. And this, I wonder if the dairy restaurant in some way is the functional equivalent of that. It's for the cheaper good. It's for
yeah, there's a whole description in the book of the kind of confluence of things that made these things come to life in the early 20th century. There were meat strikes, and there was this threat of vegetarianism, and there were a lot of elements involved in why people started opening these places at that time. But there's also a worldwide history of eating places that try to evoke the pastoral, those pleasure gardens in England. And almost every culture, there's kind of a dairy-based eating place. The Milchhallen of Germany and Austria, the cremeries of Paris. It's kind of a worldwide cultural impulse. And how it played out in New York was very particular. Also, it negated the idea of an ethnic decor, and the decor of these places is what we now think of as kind of the formica and stainless steel luncheonette of the 50s, that kind of sanitary eating place. There was an American dairy lunch movement that I think it just slightly predates all of these Jewish places, and places like Child's and that offered fresh milk from the farm, and the decor was not of any ethnicity. It was the sanitary milking room, a tiled room with stainless steel, and then later formica, things like that. So it's a complex combination of impulses that led to the specific Jewish, Eastern European Jewish dairy restaurant of New York. And it existed in other cities where there were large Jewish populations. Not quite as many as in New York, though.
You point out that there's little evidence of Jewish dairy restaurants in the old world. So this is an active invention here that draws on.
No, I don't think so. I think there were a lot of places specializing in, there's this whole kind of restaurant in Poland, lasagna, and Sholem Aleichem has one of his characters running one of these places. So, and there were famous ones in Chernovitz. People from that city tell me there were at least 10 dairy-based restaurants. So no, I think it's very even less documentation of some of these places, especially in smaller towns in Europe. But no, I don't think. I think history doesn't continue in a absolute straight line. So some of the people who opened dairy restaurants in New York had no idea of this earlier history. They were modeling it after something they saw in New York.
Right.
So it's history doesn't work in a perfect linear way. So no, but there were clearly places that cater to milk-based, dairy-based menus in Europe.
One of the other
One or
things.
two really well-known ones that are well documented, Friedman's of Chernovitz. I mean, they called it a Milchhallen, which was the German word for a milk pavilion. So there were lots of those, and not specifically run by Jews, but when a Jew ran one, and if they wanted to conform with dietary law, it would become something very much like the New York dairy restaurants.
One of the things that you point out beyond the restaurant itself is the idea of what the milchedicke personality, a milk toast, and you make the point that Tevye, Shalom Aleicham's Tevye, the fiddler on the roof, Tevye, is yes, he's a milkman, but even before he's a milkman, he's a milk toast.
Well,
could you talk about that a little?
Personality, it's a little even more complex. It's somebody who maybe it is just an intellectual, somebody who can be, whose thoughts can trump the physical world, and then they don't have to operate completely in the physical world. The fellow who ran this dairy in Warsaw that Sholem Aleichem writes about, Yossel Kotek, he was an obsessive planner and schemer. He was constantly scheming to design social organizations for Jews in Warsaw, but nothing happened. It was all ended at the level of thinking about it all, and planning it all. So it's that kind of personality. And there was a famous American comic strip in the early 20th century called The Timid Soul, and that was a character named Casper Milquetoast. And Milquetoast was a dish in the American dairy lunch. It was bits of toast soaking in a bowl of milk. That was a dairy dish, and so not particularly an Eastern European at all. So,
when you write about people coming to the Jews immigrating and bringing dietary laws and observance with them, many people didn't immigrate and stayed, and in many cases it's because they regarded America as the Treffen Medina, the country without observance, the country specifically without dietary observance. And there's an art you found an article in the Sun, a New York newspaper, in 1903 about, and I think I'm quoting here, while some may observe dietary laws at home, when they are away from home, they eat what they like. That is, that this was a place with opportunities to go well beyond whatever cuisine you brought with you or observance you brought with you.
Well, there's many levels of dietary observance, and one of them is purely the dishes of the cuisine that you like, and then you can leave everything else. You can convert to Christianity and still like blintzes. I mean, you can go that far away from ritual observance. So somehow the cuisine can transcend the thing that set it in motion. And that's a constant story, if you look at articles from the early 20th century, people either going to restaurants because it's something their own wives can't provide. They don't know how to make pitcha, so they have to go out to a restaurant to have, calf's foot jelly. So it works all different ways, every possible permutation. And, you know, some people brought up at that time, they couldn't wait to get away from Eastern European food and discover, you know, the cuisines of the world. So, you know, that food had connotations of poverty to them. So it's a complicated thing, eating.
That it is. Near the end, you write about kosher style dining, the idea that one could retain some element of the food, but without going through the observance that the shaychet, the ritual slaughter, the prayer, the separation of meat and milk,
Well,
perhaps just keeping pork off the table.
yeah, that definitely is something that came about, you know, in the 40s and 50s. All these places on the Upper West Side, like Tiptoe Inn, they'd have blintzes on their menu, but they'd also have ham steaks. So this was catering to that moment where people were opening up their tastes to all kinds of food. But, you know, the dairy restaurant, as I encountered it in the, you know, was a young man in the 70s and the early 80s, I think because it actually separated itself from the mainstream of eating and being able to serve everything, meat included. I think that was another part of the atmosphere. You know, they smelled of frying butter, not of brisket of beef. I mean, there was really a different atmosphere there because of the dietary limitations.
We're starting to get questions that are coming in, so I'm going to pull the computer closer to me so I can actually read what's on my screen. Before I do, let me remind people that we're talking to Ben Katchor. The book is The Dairy Restaurant. If you haven't figured that out by now, it's available through your local independent bookseller and in New York through McNally Jackson, who is partnered with the Tenement Museum on this. So I have a question here that I'll provide half of an answer to before I turn it over to you. It's, did dairy restaurants exist outside of New York City? Were they similar to those in New York? My wife and I moved to Philadelphia in the, I guess in about 1973, actually exactly that. My parents, who were kosher, came down to visit us from rural Connecticut, and we took them to this place, the Ambassador, on Girard Avenue. Took them there a couple of times, and then by maybe 1975 or 76, it was gone. So I can answer the question in part. Yes, they existed in Philadelphia, and turn it over to you, Ben.
Yeah, they existed wherever there was a large enough Jewish population that was interested in this cuisine. So there were several in Philadelphia, some in few in Baltimore. I think as you went further west, there seemed to be fewer. A few in Chicago, but nothing like the density of the number in New York. In fact, some of them, like the one in Baltimore, I think was called the New York Dairy Restaurant. They were kind of trading on the idea that you could have the dairy dishes you were used to when you visited New York. So, but the book, it covers, you know, I try to cover the whole, at least the whole United States and some other parts of the world. So.
And I can assure the viewer that if you get the book, there is an encyclopedic listing of these restaurants with bits and pieces of stories about them, and even some that Ben wasn't able to run down beyond the names and the cities. Here's another question. When did dairy restaurants start to close?
Oh, I think the heyday was sort of in the 40s and 50s. And so I caught it at the absolute tail end. I mean, they all were these forlorn places. It's sort of in that moment, I think now there's been sort of a revival of religious observance, but in the 70s and 80s, a lot of these places were not too busy. There were several in the garment district. So once a week, someone whose steady diet was pastrami, they were just out of indigestion, had to go to a dairy restaurant. And
But what they might order would be pastrami carp, which was my father's favorite at the Ambassador.
yeah, there was a pastrami, a fish-based pastrami, but yeah, they disappeared pretty quickly in the 70s and 80s. You know, with a few exceptions that's lingered on, like the Ratners down on Delancey Street, the B&H. There are always a few. I mean, in any Hasidic neighborhood, there are kosher pizzerias, which are in fact dairy restaurants. They just are more facing toward the Mediterranean and Italy than to Eastern Europe in their menu. But those
And you point out that falafel enters the United States from the Middle East in a way that's part of that, becomes part of that tradition.
Yeah, those are dairy restaurants. They're not the Eastern European type, but so yeah, in that sense, there are quite a few of those still. And
one of our viewers asks if you would tell us more about your own personal experiences in dairy restaurants.
well, yeah, I go into that in the book. I mean, I go all the ones I frequented. And as I said, some of them, there was the Diamond Dairy. It was in the mezzanine level of a jewelry exchange on 47th Street. And that was one of the few places in New York in Manhattan, that you could walk into and hear Yiddish spoken at the counter among the diamond dealers. But they were all, as I said, kind of on their last legs. And everyone they sort of knew it. I mean, so there was a sadness to them, but you know, the food was still pretty good in most of them. And I don't know, it's a big part of the book. I actually met the woman who I ended up being married to in a dairy restaurant. So all kinds of things went on in these places.
Another question from a reader. How did you do your research for this book? Newspapers, menus, Yiddish press. Also, same questioner, could you see this work of yours becoming an opera?
Yeah, there is definitely a kind of narrative thread through this book, and you could build a story that's more about how the thread from the Garden of Eden, the expulsion from the Garden of Eden to the expulsion from the American dairy restaurant because of them closing. Yeah, so yeah, it crosses my mind that there's a good dramatic story there. I did a bunch of operas with a musician named Mark Mulcahy, and an earlier one with a group called Bang on a Can. So that opera. But how did you research this book? I took kind of the Millichdik approach, the Millich approach, and I contemplated this subject, and I let it take me back to the Garden of Eden and through all of world history, which is not a practical way to approach the writing of a book. So it took a long time. But yeah, newspapers, menus, the Yiddish press they mentioned. My Yiddish got much better since I started researching this book. But that's, 20 years ago it started. But it's, it's any book that covers the whole world. There are limitations of language. Before Google Translate, it would have been hard for me to read the Polish sources I came across. And but yeah, it was just the way it's a bare out. I know it's a 500-page book, but it's really a bare outline of the social and cultural history of the dairy restaurant, because that's an incredibly complicated subject. And I have a website, dairyrestauranthistory.com, which is sort of an addendum to the book, and people are sending me information all the time, and it'll grow to another few hundred pages probably.
For the second edition.
Yeah.
And I noted in reading it, I noted that my Yiddish was sharpening again, even as I read it. So we could do the next interview when the next edition comes out in Ganzen Yiddish, if you'd like. Another viewer writes in, a Jew. I feel like I'm Abraham Kahan started questions with a viewer writes in, a reader asks, a Jewish vegetarian is interested in hearing about the first vegetarian practices that you mentioned.
Yeah, that goes back to the beginning of vegetarianism, because it is kind of something people were proselytizing about early on, is really well documented. And there's a point where that history crosses into Eastern Europe through Tolstoy, through all other sorts of connections that I bring out in the book. There's an idea that Jewish dietary law is a kind of modified vegetarianism, and that you build a lot of limitations and obstacles into meat eating. You need a trained slaughterer. Not everyone can do that. Anyone can pick an apple and eat it. But if you want to get involved in meat eating, there are all kinds of safeguards to how that should be done. So yeah, the book, there's a big section on how this all meets the history of vegetarianism. And there was in the, when did it start? In the early 20th century, a vegetarian movement in Yiddish. There was a magazine, and there was Unser Gesund was kind of a health magazine, but there was also a specifically vegetarian journal. So yeah, that history is all laid out in the book.
Yeah, we write about history, talk about history. Oscar Handlin, who is was the dean of American immigration historians, wrote a memoir at one point, I recall, in which he talked about his first job was in his family's grocery in Brooklyn, ladling milk out of a milk barrel and putting it into the pots or the bottles that people brought into the shop with them. So he's milkadic in more than one way, and a historian in many ways as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, milk handling before refrigeration was a complicated thing. And it was a tremendous, there was on one hand, milk is a culture that is great for growing tuberculosis, bacilli, and other diseases in. And it's also, there was a whole idea of it being a curative drink. the milk cure and all kinds of clabbered milks as a curative thing. So yeah, these dairy restaurants were very popular among vegetarians because other than the fish that they served, you could, put together a really good vegetarian meal.
I never understood the attraction of buttermilk, which is a big feature of many of these places.
Yeah, well, apparently something like 70% of Ashkenazi Jews have a milk intolerance. But a lot of the dairy products in these restaurants, which in the form of cheese and sour cream, yogurt, buttermilk, and when you clabber milk, the lactose content is less. So I think that explains why they weren't all drinking glasses of fresh milk. More likely farmer's cheese or
Right.
things like sour cream. So milk intolerance. But anyway, some people ate until they were suffering from indigestion in those days. And I always point out they used to have bromo seltzer dispensers hanging behind the counter of every luncheonette. And, you would matter-of-factly have a bromo seltzer, which is an antacid seltzer after you ate. So probably less in dairy restaurants than in delicatessens.
Yeah, one of my early career was as a waiter in a kosher resort hotel, and people would eat to pain them, and they'd come in the next morning at breakfast, and they'd want a glaze of Wasser, a glass of hot water, some stewed prunes, and some prune juice. So the day would start with with a fresh slate. But
What hotel was that? Was that in a hotel?
People define themselves. It was a resort hotel in Eastern, near where you are right now.
Oh, okay, up there.
Like Lodge in Lebanon. You should. I think very little of a Grand Lake Lodge is left now. But what I guess it's in many ways like the dairy restaurant itself. It's in research. It exists through the stories that one generation passes on to the other. I want to thank you for creating this book. It's more than written. It's drawn. It's imagined. It's researched. You've brought something important back to life, something revealing back to life. You've done in looking at the culture of the dairy restaurant, what the museum tries to do, in looking at the facts of immigrant life in late 19th and early 20th century New York. I can't wait till this pandemic eases to the point that I can invite you to the Tenement Museum and show you how we try to do some of what you do so brilliantly. And so let me hold up the book one more time. It's Ben Katchor. It's the Dairy Restaurant. McNally Jackson, I think, has it available online. And I want to thank you for participating in this online tenement talk. We try to do this once a week live at the museum. Now we're doing it once a week online. And you can go to tenement.org and get the schedule of future events. Ben, thank you so much for participating in this.
Thank you.
And stay safe.
My pleasure to be here.
Take care then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.